Christopher.
Thank you, Zachary, and NCJ-FCJ for making this space for us to hold this webinar today. Good morning to some of you and afternoon to others. Thanks a lot for joining us today. On behalf of Transforming Communities, Technical Assistance Training and Resource Center, TC-TAT for short, welcome to today's webinar on survivor-centered advocacy. Today's webinar and slides will be posted on our website, www.transformcommunities.org. As Zachary mentioned, I am Christopher Watson, the National Program Manager with TC-TAT. Also on today's webinar are Darna Garsky, TC-TAT Executive Director, and Alana Bloom, Project Associate. So, as you can see on the second slide, for the past 17 years, Transforming Communities has provided intensive training, technical assistance, and resources to organizations working to end violence against women on the national level with a special emphasis on prevention work and organizational development. Overall, TC-TAT's work has to advance new practices, skills, movement building, and policies to prevent violence against women and other related forms of abuse, including domestic violence, sexual assault, teen dating violence, and gender-based bullying. Visit our website for more information and for upcoming events. So over the past year, TC-TAT has embarked on a project funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to offer technical support, training, and resources to organizations in all 21 OVW program-funded areas. This project, Grow Forward, is currently working with 23 organizations over a year's period to create organizational structures and practices that increase our capacity to sustain the future of our organizations. We hosted a 4-day Immersion Institute back in July that brought together all 23 organizations for an intensive 4-day training. TC-TAT is now working with several innovative organizations in the U.S. to host 4 webinars for organizations in all 21 program areas. All 4 webinars are designed based on your feedback to our national survey conducted back in January. We're excited to offer you more information at the conclusion of this webinar. TC-TAT is excited to offer today's webinar in partnership with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. TC-TAT has partnered with WSCADIV over the years on several projects to offer training and resources as part of our National Advisory Committee and as a strategic partner in the work to end violence against women. Today's offering will focus on survivor-centered advocacy. In this particular webinar, we will explore advancing liberations through program design and delivery and identifying pathways forward. We will touch on promising practices in survivor-centered advocacy, such as rethinking shelter rules, mobile Latina advocacy, working with chemically dependent survivors, trauma-informed facility design, and rapid rehousing. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone to Judy, Chen, and Linda Olsen. Their bios are included on our website. Welcome, Judy and Linda. I will turn everything over to you.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Judy Chen
and Linda Olsen.
We're super excited to be here with you today. I serve as the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Domestic Violence Coalition here in Washington State. Prior to that, I was the first Executive Director of an Asian and Pacific Islander organization in Seattle that uses community organizing strategies on sexual and domestic violence and human trafficking. Linda?
And I'm Linda Olsen. I'm the Housing Coordinator at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I have 28 years of experience in executive leadership, shelter management, victim advocacy, government contracts administration, and public policy. I started in rural Kentucky and have developed emergency shelters, both communal living and scattered site apartments, transitional housing for DV survivors needing drug and alcohol treatment, and rental assistance programs with services.
So we're going to start with a poll. Oops, is there a poll? And we're curious to know a little bit more about you because there are so many of you, it's a little bit hard to track in the aggregate. So please take the poll. I like this live action update. Okay, so we can see there are, boy, we're pretty evenly split here. So we have a lot of dual domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, domestic violence advocates, sexual assault survivor advocates, some folks at administration, and other kinds of providers. So welcome to all of you, and thanks for helping us figure out a little bit more about how to shape our time with you today. So we're going to be talking about some super important and exciting topics, and we're so glad you've taken the time to be with us about thinking through and rethinking survivor-centered advocacy. And as we do that, we're going to be talking about leadership in advocacy, some principles in survivor-centered advocacy, and then highlighting a few promising practices. I want to let you know that we have a lot of, we have just so much material that we could share with you. So to use your time well, we're going to be touching on a couple of things, and then you can follow up with Christopher. We have sent him some materials so that he can share those with you if you're interested. But first, let's review. Advocates are wonderful, wonderful people. I know that some of the things that we'll be talking about today can be quite challenging, and I just want to say you all are important. The work that you do is very important. It's really difficult, and it's not as valued in society as it deserves to be. As we do this work, pausing to reflect and realign what we're doing can actually reduce our stress and improve what we're doing. Many of the topics we'll be talking about are challenging to common advocacy practices and sort of standard operating procedures in our field. So what we'll be talking about is offered in a spirit of challenge and not criticism of your work. Our belief is every community can and should decide for itself what works for you all with survivors. So and not every challenge that we present and not every emerging model we present will fit for you, and that's fine. We're hoping today that we'll spark your critical thinking, your very important critical thinking, which is, of course, one of the core practices of advocacy. And support your work as you shape it for the future, because here's the thing. If we as advocates don't decide how to shape the future of our work, others will decide for us. So that's a pause button over here. Pause button. Oops, I can't draw. Okay. Thinking about some context for us, the world, here's my slide. The world has changed. In the past 30 years, since the beginning of what used to be called the rape crisis movement and the battered women's movement, and now we think of as movement to end sexual assault and domestic violence, and a lot has changed. We've had great changes in the U.S. economy, in what housing costs are for families, and women's income has risen, but also income disparities have grown greatly in our society. There's been sea changes in technology, and that's what these little images over here of what computers and fashion and just cell phones used to look like, what are the changes that have occurred. And then, of course, women's legal rights and children's legal rights have changed so much. So, for example, the advent of no-fault divorce. We as a field and fields have been incredibly successful in changing public opinion on child sexual abuse, rape, and domestic violence. 30 years ago, there was not a broad consensus in U.S. society that child sexual abuse, rape, and domestic violence existed, or that they were wrong. And we talked a lot about breaking the silence. Well, guess what? We don't have to talk about that anymore because we've broken the silence. We've been successful in creating laws, funding, a broad system response in pretty much every corner of society. How effectively those work is still in progress, but we have been very effective in creating these responses initially. And then, of course, we have this national network of crisis services that did not exist 30 years ago. So we have been very successful. At the same time, we have to be cognizant that society has changed. It's been 30 years, and now we get to decide what we'll keep doing, what we'll stop doing, and what we will start doing. And in particular, one of the things that we'll be sort of weaving in today is thinking about what are some of the racial disparities in our work and in the impact of sexual and domestic violence on survivors. We do this work, so here's how I'm inviting you to think about this. We do our work in a context of society that struggles with all kinds of inequality, including racial inequality. And one of the successes of our work in the last 30 years is having more research and data from our own services in understanding just how these play out. So now we know, for example, that domestic violence disproportionately affects women of color, immigrants, refugees, and Native women. So in Washington State, our fatality review research has consistently found that women of color and immigrant and refugee women die at the hands of their abusers at a rate that's 2 to 5 times that of white non-Hispanic women. And in the U.S. overall, African American women comprise only 8% of the population, but account for about almost a third of all female domestic violence homicides. And we also know that regarding sexual assault on Native American and Alaskan Native women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped than other women in the U.S. So, you know, we could go on and on about what the disparities are, but this is one of the lenses that we invite you to hold on to today. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is leadership in advocacy. Leadership and advocacy. And we'll be talking about, this is to help us think about framing, you know, what our role is as survivor-centered advocates. Something for us to think about is that we're challenged to not follow this heroic model that is so common in society. And in this heroic model, and then, you know, of course, as we train new advocates to think about, wow, pay attention to this kind of stuff. The heroic model is a central archetype in legend and in stories and in our history and religion. It's saying that there's a lone person who embodies authority and who knows answers, the answer, and defends and rescues people and fights villains and people who are hurting others. And this is a really hard one for us to pay attention to because this model is harder, this shared leadership model. This one is, you know, maybe more familiar to you if you're rooted in an indigenous culture, but I'll say that for me it's really hard because it's not about just sharing leadership, it's about dispersing control and that everyone has some authority regardless of their position. It's saying that we're open to making mistakes, and I'll just say for myself, coming into domestic violence work, I realized after a while that I was so afraid of making mistakes and admitting mistakes because I somewhere inside myself, I believed that if I made a mistake, someone would die, that a survivor would die if I made any mistakes. And that is, you know, there's a part of that, there's a kernel of truth that's true, but then overall this can influence us to get into a mode where we aren't able to be open to thinking about feedback that we're getting, especially from survivors. So I encourage you to think about these two models in our work, especially this tendency for us to want to be superhuman. Zachary, just so you know, I'm not able to do the drawing and the pointer on here.
If you mouse over the word draw at the top of your screen, it should become active for you.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So, nope. Okay. So, let's see, where was I? And then we are really challenged with this idea of how to of knowing the answer versus developing the answer. And I think this is part of our desire to be able to answer questions for survivors where sometimes there aren't answers, and questions for our organizations in terms of where we're going in the future where there may not be a definitive answer. So this concept of praxis is a fancy word for doing the kind of survivor-centered advocacy that's the most effective, where we, instead of saying, here's the formula for you to get safe, we use a process of reflection, thinking through an idea, having a theory of what to do, trying it out, saying, okay, what worked well there? What could we do differently next time? And then trying again. And I want to just acknowledge our colleagues from Praxis International in Duluth, Minnesota for their work in advancing this model for our field. And I encourage you to check out their materials. Now, when I was talking with Christopher and Donna at TC-TAT about this webinar, they said people are really curious about this drama triangle and what this has to do with our work. So I'm super excited to be able to talk with you about it. So just to give you, to set this up, the drama triangle is a psychological model, and I'll explain what that is, and then I'll explain how it was used by an organization called Seattle Rape Relief, which at the time of its closure about 10 years ago was the longest running rape crisis center in the United States, and they did some fantastic work that we're still learning from today. And helping us think through how this can illuminate our understanding of our role as survivor-centered advocates in our work with survivors and with people who are using violence. The drama triangle is a psychological model. It was created in 1968 by a person named Stephen Cartman, and it's used to describe a common dynamic in daily human interaction and also in literature and in human stories. And here's the thing. Whenever there's conflict, we have a tendency to see ourselves as, oh good, this is working, as either the victim of the conflict or as the rescuer in the conflict. There is, we don't tend to see ourselves as the person who's causing the conflict or the person who's the source of the problem. And this can be very useful well, let me just back up. So for example, when I'm driving in traffic and somebody cuts in front of me, I see myself as the victim of that person, or I might see someone else do that and I say, oh, you know, I saw that happen. I'm trying to rescue them. Rarely do I notice my own errors in driving because I have good reasons for all the mistakes I make driving, but other people who are driving don't have good reasons. Do you see what I mean? So in our work, what Seattle Rape Relief came up with was this idea of adding capital letters and then small letters for each of these roles. Capital letters and small letters. And what they said, they use this in their volunteer training, and what they were saying is that as advocates, these roles are true to reality, that we have a role, we don't use the word rescuer, we say advocate, survivor, and person who is using oppressive violence. Those are all true things. That's descriptive of reality. The problem is when we get into the idea of capital letter roles. When we slide into that, we see ourselves as rescuers, like Superman, with a capital R on our chest, and this sets in motion having unconscious and unintentional control over survivors. And because it's so unintentional and unconscious and covert, it's really hard for us to recognize this and to acknowledge it. And then we see survivors in their capital V victim roles with a big V on their foreheads, defined only by their victimization and not by their power. And as the great community organizer Suzanne Farr says, P-H-A-R-R, if anyone wants to look her up. What if we had organized in our field around survivors' power instead of around survivors' victimization? And then when we put a capital P, persecutor, on the foreheads of people who are harming others, it's dehumanizing, of course. It's dehumanizing. And that's a trap. You know, the morality of that aside, it's also very impractical. And here's why it's impractical, because we know that people who are causing harm to others through sexual and domestic violence are often family members and people in their community and friends, people who they have feelings, who survivors have feelings of that are really mixed. They may love that person or at least have to deal with them all the time. They can't be, these folks who are capital P persecutors, they can't be voted off the island. When we put a capital P on someone's forehead like this, it gets in the way of practical safety planning and healing and our ability to be supportive around that with survivors. By the way, here's another way that this triangle can be very useful. Because people don't like to see themselves in this role, they will put themselves here and here. And this is when perpetrators will say, well, actually, this person is victimizing me. I am the victim. I am the victim. So this triangle helps explain that. Okay. Am I able to? There we go. So this helps us see that getting to survivor-centered advocacy isn't just about how we behave as individual advocates or even as a group of advocates. It's also about how we think about our work and how the whole group thinks about our work and how it's structured. So program structure, how our program design of our services, what our facilities look like, how people experience our facilities, whether that's a shelter or a counseling office or any other type of place. What the culture is within our organization. By this I don't mean like a ethnic or social culture. I mean like what are the accepted truths in our work that we don't even question, we don't even think about. And of course budgets. You know, when we recognizing that budgets for direct service programs are an expression of our values, and that how we spend money is a way of saying what our mission and our values are and what we're trying to achieve. So for example, one of the questions for survivor-centered advocacy and budgets is, what are staff really spending our time on? Because for direct service programs, personnel, which means staff, is the #1 cost for almost all of those organizations. So if that's the #1 cost, what are staff spending their time on? How are we spending the money? So for example, for DV shelter programs, if staff are spending a lot of their time helping residents cope with communal living rules and enforcing those rules and helping residents get along with each other, rather than actually spending time supporting residents with safety planning and healing from trauma, that is a problem. That's a problem. That's a moment for us to pause and reflect and say, is this what we intend to do with the scarce financial resources that come into this organization? Is this the best use, the highest use of this money for healing and safety? And that's why problems in advocacy can't be fixed with just staff training. What we have to do is think about what's the structure of our work. Okay. So now we get to talk about principles of our work in advocacy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some philosophical differences and gaps between advocacy, what advocacy looks like when we are responsive to the systems that are around us. And by systems, that's kind of a fancy word just for saying criminal justice systems, police, courts, judges, prosecutors, child welfare, the organizations in our community, clergy, religious congregations. What are some other systems? Hospitals? Us. Yeah, well, we're a system too at this moment. So what does it look like when it's centered on systems, and what does it look like when it's centered on survivors? And again, these are challenges, not criticisms for us. So you can see my fantastic graphic design skills here. Okay. So when advocacy is centered around systems, the primary focus is on how to get this person safe. And then after that is how can we support this person to have increased independence and healing. When we center on survivors, we first look at how can we help this person increase their own self-determination and understand that out of that is what grows safety. Out of that is what grows safety. So safety doesn't necessarily come first. It's about how to increase that survivor's self-determination. We'll dive into this a little bit more in a few minutes. When we're doing advocacy, we see survivors as having a lot of needs, and we develop our programming around what are that person's needs, what's that family's needs, rather than coming from a place of building on the strengths, and out of the strengths, how do we address needs? And this is something to think about for those of you who've done community organizing or community building. This is the community assets model, right? So we build on assets, not on weaknesses. When we're focused on what systems need, there's just one model that works for everybody, and it will work better for some people and not work better for a lot of people. When we're focused on what survivors need, we have really flexible approaches that say, how can we have an approach that will work for the most silenced person, the most silenced and least heard survivor who is experiencing the most barriers? Because if we build it for the person who has the most barriers, then it'll work for everybody. When we have advocacy that's focused on systems, we're trying to connect survivors to us as providers and to other providers. When we focus on what survivors need, we recognize that we are, as advocates, are in people's lives for really a short window of time compared to their whole lifetime. It may seem that you have some clients that you see forever, but compared to their whole lifetime, the time that they spend with us is actually really short. So our job, and we're not going to be there to support them after their time with us for the most part, because people move on. So our job is to really help them connect back to community. And this is what, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, this is one of the things that separates, for example, people who become homeless and people who don't, is whether or not they're connected to their own community. We all care about trauma. I know that you all care about trauma, and it's one of the things that drives your passion for this work. Our challenge at this moment in our field is to have our services designed around trauma and our facilities designed to remedy trauma. And again, I would imagine that we all care about being culturally inclusive, and we are challenged to work beyond trying to just include people, beyond inclusion, which, by the way, is the name of a book by Leticia Nieto, N-I-E-T-O, who does some great work with domestic and sexual violence programs. We're called to go beyond inclusion to look at how structural exclusion, how structural racism and oppression in particular operate to keep people harmed and in harm's way. And we recognize that around survivor-centered advocacy that accountability, holding people accountable, is not just for perpetrators or offenders, not just for the people who are causing harm, or just for survivors to be obedient to systems, and we all know what that's like. Accountability is for everyone, and we can have positive accountability for our learning and change. So how can it look, how does it look on a very practical basis? Because I know as advocates, you all are very practical people. On the ground, how does this look different, and where can we see some gaps? Well, you know, we all intend to do safety planning all the time. But it doesn't always work out that way, so there's really a lot of challenge around, are we doing safety planning just at the beginning of our time with people, or do we have safety planning that is flexible and ongoing because we're helping people build their skills, so again, so that when they're not with us in the future, they have these skills without us. Is our confidentiality incumbent on survivors? Do we ask people to sign pieces of paper saying they won't reveal the location, they won't reveal who else is in group, et cetera? Or do we understand that confidentiality is what's incumbent on us as advocates under the law, under VAWA, and for many of you under your state law or your tribal laws? And that asking people who are subject to so many institutions and systems to sign yet another piece of paper saying what they will or will not do is a problem, and it's probably not going to work. And that actually having a more conversational approach around, can you make this kind of commitment or not? You know, group isn't for everyone. Support group isn't a great fit for everyone. So how can we have that kind of conversation? Are we asking people to come to us, or are we able to come to them, especially for those who aren't able to come to us because of so many transportation barriers, especially in rural areas, or because of racial segregation and lack of bus service in poor communities? And are we able to recognize that some people want to come and not have any, want to come to where we are, and some people need to come for us to come to them. Do we mandate services? So in order, for example, from DV land, do we mandate that people participate in groups or participate in services in order to stay in shelter? What does that mean for people who are mandated to do a lot of things? Or do we recognize that, that people can decide for themselves on what kind of services are going to be helpful for them if we are in a process of engagement with them? Do we have a lot of rules or minimal rules? And then especially around, helping for child sexual abuse survivors and for children who have grown up in a situation of domestic violence, and recognizing that often those are the same kids. Do those kids see the non-abusive parent or parents obeying us as staff, for example, in a shelter setting or as they're dealing with the criminal legal system? Do they see their parents, the non-abusive parent, churning through systems? Or do they see their non-abusive parent helping them heal, and that we're able to guide that parent to navigate systems, but they don't have to obey the system? The non-abusive parents are able to make choices that work for them and their kids. And then finally, are we kind of in a defensive mode around we have to protect what we've built here because there's so much criticism and active attack on sexual and domestic violence programs? And I just want to put that out there, that we recognize that that's the reality for so many of you. But does that put us in a defensive mode 100% of the time, or are we able to engage with survivors and community to keep on adjusting what we're doing over time? Because we know that the world is changing and has changed even just with technology. So this is a great, by the way, I want to just credit our coworkers here, Tira Lindquist and Meta Earlywine and Paula Morinigo, who've done some great work on helping us think through these frameworks here. So one of the things that I found to be super helpful in my resistance to these ideas was thinking about, okay, when are survivors seeking our help? When do we see them? So this is a graph that's made up by the great Connie Burke at the Northwest Network for LGBT, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, lesbian, and gay survivors of abuse. Oh, I'm having trouble with my arrow. Okay, well, so here's how it works. From the left to the right of your screen, so from where it says 0 to where it says Connie's name, that's time. That's what's happening over time. And then where it goes from 0 to 25, from the top to bottom of your screen, that's the level of trauma, abuse, and violence and re-victimization. So the dotted gray line is the amount of violence and abuse that people are experiencing. And you can see that it gets worse and worse over time. Even if the violence is happening only at the beginning, the trauma and re-victimization can keep going on and get worse and worse. And then the kind of resources that people have, that's the black solid line that's going down, down, down. So over time, people's resources, and I'm not talking just about money, though of course we know that sexual and domestic violence is impoverishing. It's impoverishing. But it's also connection to family and friends, being able to keep your job, being able to keep your apartment, feeling connected spiritually or religiously if that's important to a person, having friends and family who believe you and who don't think you're crazy, and who don't think that people say, well, why don't you just snap out of it? People can be very patient at the beginning, but then they run out of patience, and then you end up with no friends. And of course, the perpetrator, the person who's using violence, is actively trying to isolate that person. So, Zachary, can you help me with my line drawing here?
Sure. So you've got the draw tool currently selected on the left side of your screen. You'll have a icon that shows a pencil. Go ahead and click on that.
I'm not getting the icon.
Okay.
Can you draw a line, Zachary?
Where would you like it?
I can draw the line for you, Judy.
Oh, great, great.
Okay, let me get my red marker here. Not quite straight, but...
There we go. Okay. So thank you, Christopher.
You're
So
welcome.
this is when we see people. We see people when things are already really, really bad. We see people when they have lost their resources. You know, from the DV end of things, nobody comes to shelter if they have a credit card, right? Because why would you do that? Why not go to a hotel, right? And we know that people come to get help around their sexual violation experiences when they are really having a hard time coping. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people, when they're having a hard time coping with daily living, that's often when we see them. So, and we see people when the level of trauma and violence and abuse is way up. It's not at the beginning. So, so here are a couple of things to think about. Remember when I said something about social capital? I said something about social capital at the beginning of a little while ago. What was about that?
Sorry, Judy,
about connecting people. Sorry, Christopher?
Sorry, there's a quick question. Some folks are wondering what the numbers on the left represent, the 0 through 25.
That means the amount of violence, and that means the level of the violence, how bad it is, and the trauma.
Excellent, thank you.
So, you know, we know that, I mean, our colleague June Lovell always says, you know, batterers don't come out swinging, not on the first date, right? The violence escalates. So remember when I said back over here, ooh, you can tell I'm very sophisticated with my work here. Okay, survivors connect to community. Remember when we talked about that? Survivors connect to communities. This is why it's important. Let's go back to that graph. Oops. Because there's this concept called social capital. And social capital means all that stuff that's not money. So it's social, not financial capital. It means connection to family and friends, feeling connected to society and your culture, and feeling like you're part of the world, and having people support you. It's a network, the safety network that's not just services, but for each of us informally, individually. So social capital turns out to be, according to some developing research that's coming out called the WestEd study, it's the difference between, it's not the WestEd study?
It's part of the National Alliance to End Homelessness work.
Thank you, Linda. It's the difference between very low-income women with children, right? Very low-income women with children who otherwise are pretty much the same, who never become homeless, who become homeless just one time, or who enter into a cycle of homelessness over and over again and are never able to stabilize. The difference between the first two groups and that last group is whether or not they have social capital, whether or not they have other people to rely on. And we know that because that's, you know, the couch surfing stuff, but it's also people who will lend you money so you can make your rent, and, you know, or who will give you money for your child's birthday so you don't end up shoplifting, so you don't end up getting embroiled with the law. So this is why it's so important for us to be thinking about in our survivor-centered advocacy, how do we connect and help survivors reconnect with community? And here's something else for us to think about. The last thing on this slide is, what impact does it have on our perception of survivors when we see them over here versus over here? What would happen if we saw them over here or over here when the violence was just starting out and they still had resources and they weren't so personally devastated? Would we see them as more capable people? Okay, so that's food for thought. Now, why is this all important? It's because self-determination is what helps lead to safety. People who are using oppressive violence attempt to turn people into things. They take charge of their victims' lives. They erase their dignity. And violence is just the enforcement mechanism, right? Violence is how you make that happen. So this is one of the things that we know, for example, well, we'll just stop there. So, so this is why I put in the steering wheel here, because is someone in the steering wheel of their own life or someone else holding their steering wheel? Once we understand that violence is the enforcement mechanism, it helps us understand what safety means for this person. The remedy to having someone else take your steering wheel is to get it back. So this is why supporting survivors to regain their human dignity and having choices and being in charge of their own life is central to safety and not the other way around. And again, I want to acknowledge Connie Burke for this important concept. So self-determination is the path. Safety and empowerment are the outcomes of that. That's the outcome. And you can see this is very different from kind of the mainstream systems approach to advocacy, where the idea is we have to help that person get safe right away. Even if she or he doesn't want to, we have to help them do it because that's how they're going to be okay. So I want to just pause here and see what you all think. Christopher or Zachary, can you help people do the smiley face or the frowny face to get a sense of do you agree or disagree?
Sure. So to provide visual feedback, at the top of your screen is an icon with a person with their hand raised. Go ahead and click the arrow just to the right of that, and a drop-down menu will appear, and you'll have options to agree or disagree. So go ahead and select the one that applies. Great.
Okay, thank you. So, and then Christopher, do you have some questions that you can raise to us? Maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions at this time, or comments?
There are no questions currently in the pod, but if folks have questions, Judy and Linda are both great at asking questions. I threw a few out at them yesterday, so definitely feel free to put those into the Q&A box, and we'll get those answered.
So, Christopher, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A pod. Would you like us to read them?
Yes, that would be great. I'm having trouble navigating through the pod. Thanks, Zachary.
So looking at your graph from earlier, a participant asked on what scale the level of violence is measured.
This is Judy. So that's a made-up graph, just so you know. And the scale, if you're referring to, is it just physical violence or is it other kinds of oppressive control? What I mean is oppressive control. So isolation, you know, this broader definition of what sexual and domestic violence is, or sexual violence and domestic violence. So control, isolation, victim blaming, having others used against you, and, you know, just recognizing that the violence is just part of that. But, you know, it's the top, the axis that is the vertical axis up and down is meant to be severity.
And just adding on to that, this is Linda. One of the things about the Northwest Network, our great local resource here, is that they do not operate shelter. They really work with a population and try to do a lot of community engagement and prevention work, so they catch people earlier on. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is the informed response of catching people earlier on and really being able to notice when they still have resources and when the violence and oppression is not so horribly devastating, has been beneficial as far as providing services, advocacy, and empowerment.
Thank you. You mentioned affecting the community response system. How could that be done if you work for the Navy?
Excellent question. I want to just say hats off to the advocates here who are from family advocacy centers, family advocacy programs, and naval bases and in other military stations. We have a lot of those in Washington State and have really been informed by the work of advocates there. What I have seen, and maybe Linda can also comment, is that figuring out how to be a systems advocate is so important because there's so much control and power that especially military systems have over the lives of people who are serving in the service and then their family members. And that has been, that work has been done quite effectively in a number of places around having communication with command staff and then people who are lower down on the chain around why, just the stuff, why that typically people have the victim blaming questions that they mean, with good intentions. Why won't she leave? Why won't she report? Why isn't counseling in this situation for the person who's using violence the best choice? How could that actually perpetuate the control that he has here? So having those kinds of dialogues around, what does safety mean? Why does increasing that person's choices actually get us towards safety?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to what Judy just said. I am well aware, since I grew up in a town where there's a military base, just how challenging it can be for advocates who work on bases. And again, our hats are off to you because it is a very different sort of community structure, authoritarian structure, and can be difficult to engage. Whole other presentation, I'm thinking.
This is Judy. Someone asked Laura if we could go back to the last slide. Here's the last slide. Do we have one more question?
Yeah, I have Sybil here, and she asks, can you talk more about how to approach talking with survivors, about expectations around confidentiality?
So I am thinking, Sybil, that you're talking about the conversation when survivors come in to our programs, particularly when they're walking into a facility, and we are hoping that they will keep that facility secret, and certainly that they won't share information about who else is there. Of course, the same could apply for support groups. And I, from my perspective, think that's a very thoughtful conversation about the secrecy of the facility, that it's intended to keep people secure. And again, as Judy's already mentioned, it is not incumbent upon the survivors to do that. It is our responsibility for the security of the building, as well as for the confidentiality of people's identity and information. So really seeking to get survivors to understand that and help us with that, and from a basis of respect, that we would want to respect each survivor's confidentiality, her privacy, where she is, and that we would hope that everybody would share that with their other folks, with their other people, survivors, and children that are in the program. I come from a long tradition where all too frequently survivors were evicted from shelter if they somehow violated the building's confidential location, secret location, or started talking about people who were in the shelter. And it is extremely challenging to penalize somebody for the responsibility that we take in that security, in the protections of privacy. And one of the things of maybe we should rethink some of our structures so that it is not so much pressure on someone who's traumatized, has all sorts of connections with a small rural community, and we just need to acknowledge what that community looks like and how we can best work with the people within our community to protect everybody.
And great questions. And just to add on to what Linda said, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on in the webinar, that in the day and age, remember we talked about 30 years ago, what made sense 30 years ago? We didn't have Google Maps 30 years ago. Now we do. And I would challenge you to, ask a couple of your friends or, people or yourself, how many seconds does it take you to find the shelter location and a satellite photo of your shelter location on Google Maps? And if that technology didn't exist a couple of years ago, but now it does. And then also if we've had the same location of our shelters for 20 or 30 years, at a certain point you reach a tipping point in the community where every taxi driver, every plumber knows, every police officer knows where it is because, especially in smaller communities, it's not hard to figure out. So then, then our charge is to think about do we have other ways to keep this location secure without trying to keep people who are very traumatized and small children, try to keep a secret, especially when our other work with them is saying you don't have to keep a secret. Okay, so thank you for your questions. We're going to talk a little bit about what are some gaps, and so that's what I think your questions have been pointing out. What are some gaps between our excellent intentions working with survivors whom we care very much about, and who we, understand in ways that the general public and other systems don't, versus what the impact of our services have been, and where could there be some gaps. So we're going to start with a poll. Oops. Where do you think, when you think about what you intend in your advocacy versus how it actually plays out, where do you feel the biggest gap? Okay, well, this is interesting. We've got some early results were for prevention and not feeling like we're doing enough on prevention. Okay, so it looks like we've got about 100 people who've completed the poll, 100, about half of them. So I can see that it looks like it's, how can we do more work on prevention? We've got to move upstream from just dealing with the tidal wave of need of people who are already hurt. Feeling like, wow, we need to do more around trauma, but then this piece around how do we work on what matters most to survivors, especially around staying in their relationships and their economics of their situation and their kids, and then just this tidal wave of need. So thanks, that's really helpful. And Christopher and Donna, feel free to help us come back to these polling results if we need to. Oh yes, pause. Okay, so particularly around this piece that you had in your poll around what do survivors often want? What are survivors looking for from us? Our coworkers here and us would posit that what survivors are looking for often is a life that's defined by more than violence, especially for people who've experienced multiple kinds of violence over a lifetime, kind of this lifetime spectrum of sexual and domestic violence and other kinds of abuses. Our systems sometimes are designed for people who've had one kind of bad situation. Well, we know that a lot of the people who come to us have a lot going on that's not so good in their lives, and that this is an intergenerational problem, especially if they're coming from a community that has been oppressed and historically traumatized. So what people are looking for often is, I want more than just to be defined by this. And thank you to Chris Billhart in Portland, Oregon, for helping us with this idea. People want help with their relationships, old relationships and new relationships, and not just intimate relationships, but their friendships, their friendship circle. Remember what we talked about with social capital? People want emotional support from us, and they want to figure out how to get better emotional support from the people who are already in their lives who are engaged in victim blaming. They want help for their kids. People will often say, the reason that I'm here is because I finally realize this is affecting my kids, right? And I want this to stop. I don't want this sexual abuse to pass on into the next generation of my family. People want to feel safer in the relationships that they have or the relationships that they hope to have, even if it's an abusive relationship or what our colleague Julia Perea, Juliaperilla, says, moving from abusive relationships to just really unhealthy, right? Sometimes that's what happens in the time that people are with us. They need help with their basic needs. It's really hard for people who are, survivors who are living in their car with their kids under a bridge to be engaged with us if they don't have stability just for what's going to happen with their kids, if they're worried about child welfare, taking their kids away because they're not able to meet those kids' basic needs on a daily basis. People want help, just not feeling so badly. They want to heal from the trauma that they've experienced. And they want help dealing with systems. And again, remember what we talked about with the racial disparities. For a lot of people, these systems are not neutral. And they're often perceived not as being helpful. They're something that's a bad thing that they have to deal with, particularly for survivors from communities of color and Native communities. They want our help navigating them. So the question for us in survivor-centered advocacy is, how is this the same or different than what you intended? Do you believe that your program is helping people with the things that they most want from us? And, the survivors that you talk to may have different ones. So this is just like engage in the question.
So Judy,
today we can help. Yes?
Sorry, Judy, we have a quick question from Evelyn that relates to the topic that you were just addressing. She asked specifically about stopping an eviction when the abuser claims that the house also belongs to him or her.
I'm not sure we're going to get to that right now.
Okay.
Do you feel like you want to answer that, Linda, as we go?
That could be a really detailed answer, but certainly the Violence Against Women Act can do a lot of protections for anything that HUD is involved in. Otherwise, I would need to understand state laws. Washington State protects in that case too. So it's just detailed according to state and what kind of housing.
And I want to refer people, by the way, to the WSCDF website, which Christopher can send out to you all in this chat somehow and through magic of technology. We have some great resources that Linda and our other colleagues here in our housing program have created that's super vast information around housing and in particular domestic violence. So thanks, Linda. So today we can help people sooner before they lose their social capital, before they lose their resources, and before their trauma and re-victimization escalates. We can go beyond this menu that we created 30 years ago of hotlines, shelter, and support groups, and some counseling and therapy to say, what does it look like to expand beyond that? Can we shift that and have more that makes more sense for people, especially the most marginalized, the least heard survivors? We can meet people where they are. We're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about mobile advocacy. We can support their stability and connection and see that as fundamental to their being able to get help from us and from their community, and reassert the fundamental role that self-determination has in survivor-centered advocacy. And that will help us support people build up their resiliency and their healing, and then engage in communities positively, not just defensively. And then just to go back to some of the things that get in the way, when we see ourselves, when we set up advocacy, not because I know that you all are just excellent advocates who aren't seeing yourself in a heroic way, but sometimes the way that we create these job descriptions and structure the work that we do gets into this rescue trap. We're on this crisis hamster wheel all the time. It's hard to think when we're on that. We have service delivery that's designed around what systems want. We have these huge gaps between what's the legal definition of rape and sexual and domestic violence, versus how survivors define it for themselves. We have part of the shadow sides of the downsides of getting so much support from systems and funding is that we've become a little enmeshed with what they want from us. And we have had a hard time sometimes moving on from what we created. And I want to just say, it's not a criticism, it's so hard to think. Christopher, can you help me with this arrow? Can you go point at the hamster wheel? Okay, in your mind, yes. It's so hard to think and to pause when we're on this hamster wheel all the time, but it's a leadership practice to pause and reflect. Because remember what we said, if we don't figure out what our services are going to look like in the future, others will figure it out for us. Okay, since we just paused, I want to move on. Christopher, is that okay? Because I'm just conscious of time here.
No, definitely.
Okay. So here's some gaps where we have that are common. And here's the thing, because they're so common, again, it's not a criticism, it's a challenge for us. If it's really a common problem, then we can see it's something systemically going wrong, not something that we've done individually. So we have these gaps around what's happening with our facilities, with this, what we've created as a traditional model of support groups that are psychoeducational and individualistic. Having so many rules in our services, not having enough resources go to prevention and moving upstream, having a kind of limited menu of services, not being as culturally relevant as we could, and focusing more, I think we have this intention, but it's hard to get there, about how do we heal the harms of abuse and support survivors with that. For their kids and secondary victims. So now we get to talk about some promising practices. Yay! So we're going to, oops, here we go, promising practices. So we're going to talk about 5 of these. Mobile advocacy and a Latina mobile advocacy model, rethinking rules in shelter, trauma-informed design for our facilities, and we'll talk about in particular domestic violence programs, but I think it also translates to sexual assault victim services. Domestic violence housing first, and housing first is a model that's used out there in the homelessness and family housing field, and how do we take some of the lessons from that into DV. And then finally, working with people who are overusing drugs and alcohol, sexual assault survivors, and domestic violence survivors. So a couple of things, caveats, cautions, is that we're not proposing any one-size-fits-all solutions. You and the survivors in your community know what will work best for you, and we get to try these things out. So this is not that we're not saying these are model practices that everyone should adopt. You get to figure that out. Okay, first up, mobile advocacy. Now, I want to just say that mobile advocacy and the idea of going to people's apartments is, kind of freaky for a lot of us, including myself. It really took me a long time to wrap my mind around this, and it really took seeing it work in Washington State. We have 73 member programs in Washington with our Washington State Coalition. Only 43 of those are shelter programs. People are using this mobile advocacy model, and you know who's using it? Especially are advocates from communities of color, in this example, Latina advocates who are doing this on the down low. And we really had to notice that and listen and hear advocates explain why they were doing this and say, pause button, reflection, why, is this so bad? It turned out that it wasn't. So this is the idea of meeting people where they are, and sometimes it works to meet them in their apartments. A lot of times it doesn't, but it also means going to their workplaces and their neighborhoods and offering resources. So Christopher, can you, oh here, look, I got it, yay. So this is this person's home. This is a farm labor, oops, it just disappeared. Well, the picture that's at the bottom left of the woman with the tent, she is living in a farm labor camp. This is her home, and you know, just imagine, I think that when we see that picture, it helps us see it's so hard for her and survivors like her, or people like her, to get to us. What's her transportation situation? Does she have, can she get a car? How is it for someone like her to come to an office where our services are? Is there any trust that she might have with what we've got to offer? Then we can see how it makes sense to go to where she is. Because one of the things we know about people who are farm laborers is that they are very, very isolated. Just a shout out to our colleagues at the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. This is Amy McIntyre, who used to do advocacy in a very rural area in sort of at the western end of the United States, of the continental United States. And this is her with some salal, which is used in all floral arrangements, well, a lot of floral arrangements in the U.S. And salal is harvested by mostly undocumented workers going into the forest with machetes and harvesting it. And the women who do this work are very subject to sexual violence and coercion. And so again, how do we meet these women where they are, these survivors where they are? The mobile advocacy holds the promise of having integrated programming that makes sense from what survivors need from their point of view, addressing a lifetime spectrum of violence that they experience not just from intimate partners or people who are around them. It's also from what the violence that they experience in border crossing and on the job. And the sexual coercion is so common. Up to 90% of women farm workers experience sexual harassment and coercion on the job. And they don't have the option, for the most part, of seeking help from the criminal legal system because they are so subject to deportation. And they're oftentimes the entire family is employed by one employer. I didn't mention that this on-the-job sexual violence is mostly from bosses, from field bosses, who are out in the fields with them or in the warehouses or the little sheds where people pick the eggs from the chickens. And women go into those little sheds alone, and then the supervisor follows them. So when we understand that sexual coercion is so prevalent for people at the margins of society, for example, Latinas who are undocumented farm workers, then that helps us think about, you know, again, not moving from the needs-based model of like what all is wrong, but the strengths-based model, what works in this community. And what we know is that this health promoter model, the promotora model, mobile advocacy, community engagement, building a network of advocates who are bilingual and bicultural, and for the most part, former farm workers. These are all strategies that are working very successfully, not just in Washington State, but all around the country in rural agricultural areas. So now we get to watch a little video that that'll help shed some light on this. And this is just a clip.
De la mar, por aquí pueden pasar. Los de adelante corren mucho y los de atrás se quedarán. Tras, 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 una mexicana que fruta vendía, ciruelas, chabacanes, melones y sandías. Melón será sandía, será la vieja del otro día.
When we spoke about, you know, how the cycle of violence and everything, you know, they were like, yeah, you know, I said, would you be interested in, you know, starting a support group, you know, for other women? And they said, yeah, we should, you know. I said, well, if you can help me find 2 more women, you know, and then we can start growing from there, that would be nice, you know. And they said that they were going to try to get each one was going to get 1 more person, you know.
Do you know that I've been with this group 10 years? 10 years, yeah. Very few breaks, few and far between, just because the women wanted to see each other every week. Now, when I'm not around, like, what was it, last Friday, I had to work in Okanagan, they still go ahead and meet. They get together in one of their homes, or they go to the park if the weather is nice, but they managed to figure out something on their own. I think it was like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I counted how many women have gone through our group here in Orville, and it was 88.
Wow.
88 women. Right now I have, I think it's 8 or 9 that are registered on my, you know, in the roster.
And what's the process if people bring visitors?
Well, because it's people that they have known, or they in their travels they meet, and you can pull out right here just so we can see. Gosh, you see it coming out right there? Actually, it comes out right here. I wish we had time. We would walk down because it's just gorgeous. And the women, once a year, we come out and just take in nature, and we talk about what the year has done. Because that's kind of the new, we do that in the spring, usually around April or May. So just the renewal of their lives, what they've gone through, the different changes that how they have gone from the situation when they first started coming to group and now where they are. So it's really a good experience, and they just love it. And we bring a lunch. There's several places along the way where we can sit and eat.
Zachary, are we back on?
Yeah, you're back.
Great. Okay. So, by the way, I think we had a little technology challenge there. If you're on the phone, you won't be able to hear the video, but you can follow along in the closed captioning pod. And then, you know, this is just a clip from a long video called Alianzas de Apoyo. You can find more from this is from the Crossing Borders Immigrant Advocacy Project from the coalition, and you can see a lot more because we have a lot of videos because our coworkers just love to take videos. So you can find it on YouTube. Just look up WSCADV, and you can see some more. So thanks for your attention there. Now we're going to talk about another promising practice, which is rethinking rules. So let's shift gears here. Now, why is it important for us to rethink the rules that we have at shelter? Because all of our rules come from really good intentions and trying to deal with the vast array of problems that come up in communal living shelter. Well, here's why, one reason why. We know that people who use domestic violence are rule makers. The rule makers. So you can all think of some rules that you've heard from abusers, things like whenever you go out, you have to answer my phone call and text within 1 minute. I get to keep track of the odometer on the car or the truck. When I come home, dinner must be ready, and I can change my mind at any time of what kind of dinner that I want, and you have to take care of it. You know, those are all rules. You can't see your friends unless I give you permission. So the purpose of these rules is to control and subjugate, and we know violence is just a tool to enforce those rules. So repairing the harms of abuse means that we have to pay attention to rules as a dynamic in domestic violence. And rethink, you know, do our rules, typical rules, help or harm? And so here's some things to think about. How can rules unintentionally replicate the abuser's control? And for survivors who come from communities where institutions particularly residential institutions, aren't neutral, where they are controlling and things to be afraid of. So especially for survivors from communities of color and immigrant and refugee communities, as well as other communities, places, LGBTQ, deaf communities, places like prisons, foster care, group homes, Indian boarding schools, juvenile detention, psychiatric hospitals, and some other kinds of hospitals can be places to be afraid of, where people have experienced these kinds of rules before. So things like curfew, that you have to be in by 10 o'clock, having zero tolerance for drugs and alcohol, when we know that people who are coming to us under really high stress, and it's actually a pretty not so great time to try to get sober. Rules like you're not allowed to call your abuser or have contact with family or friends. When we know that's really difficult, especially for survivors who are trying to negotiate safety with their abuser, and maybe it's safer for them to be in contact with them so that the abuser isn't going to ramp up their attempt to get that person back. And then having mandatory work and mandatory services in order to stay in a shelter. These are things that can have a racially disproportionate impact and can replicate the abuser's control and undermine that person's recovery, or healing from trauma and being able to build their own resiliency. So again, a challenge for us is that we don't intend it this way, but sometimes it plays out this way. So here's something that people get to think about with us, or that we can think about is, our curfew rule, what's our good intention? How can that actually play out? And what are some things we could do differently? And I encourage you to look at some materials that we've provided to Christopher, that's a mini toolkit on rethinking shelter rules. And I want to say, back to here, that in Washington State, I was just at our Rethinking Shelter Rules training. Linda and I were both there. It's amazing that within the last 6 years, so many of the programs, almost none of the programs are doing things like holding people's medication. I would say like about half of the programs in that training no longer have a curfew. We heard from quite a few programs, shelter programs, that said, we're down to about 3 rules. And if you had asked people that 6 years ago, they would have said, no, absolutely not. We need these rules in order to operate. So it can be done, and it can be done in a good way. I'm coming to the end of my time here, so I'm just going to do, oh no, I'm okay. I have a few more minutes. Okay. Here's another thing for us to think about is how are our facilities trauma informed? So I don't mean just our services, but we know that the services are influenced by the physical space that we're working in. So for example, this is what oftentimes, for those of you who do DV shelter, this is oftentimes what it looks like, right? It's a very small room. There might be 2 families in this space. This is how much room you have to do homework. How hard is it going to be for that kid to keep up, or for the non-abusive parent to help this kid with their homework? And where here can this non-abusive parent do story time and try to keep some semblance of a family routine with her kids? If she's not keeping this family routine, how do we experience that? We experience it as these kids are out of control and this mom is a bad parent. She's one of the bad choice ladies. So something for us to think about is that communal living shelter in a house that's designed for one family, having multiple families who almost all have small children who've been highly traumatized, that's really hard. And it's really, really hard for us to staff it. So how can we rethink, and this is where the source of a lot of our rules come from, right? Because we're trying to manage a situation that is created, that we could actually change, because the situation in some ways is created by the physical space, right? So And I just want to credit our amazing former coworker, Margaret Hobart, who did some incredible work. She worked with survivors and adults and kids survivors to take tons of photos in shelters in Washington State and then work with advocates to say, you know, what can we learn from this? People are doing some great work. And you can learn more at this website called buildingdignity.wiscative.org.
Judy, there was a quick question here. It says, from Brittany, sometimes clients seek rules for comfort because they are used to having rules. How do you balance that with self-determination?
That is what survivor-centered advocacy is about. So that's great because people are looking for that comfort oftentimes. And let's see, one of the things is residents sometimes hide things such as talking to their abusers for fear of being asked to leave. Yes.
So in terms of, I see there's that entire question in terms of looking at structure and wanting to have that structure, especially in order to know that everybody is on the same page. And frequently when I was in shelter, one of the things I tried to do was for the residents of the shelter at any given time to be the ones to determine their own rules and to think through what consequences might be, because that's the issue with a rule, is if someone breaks it, what is the consequence? And hopefully it wouldn't be an eviction. So there's always thinking through of what are the best ways to live in this community, to provide some structure which is intended to foster mutual respect for different people's boundaries. And I think staff need to always realize that even when residents do those rules themselves, there can be the breakdowns and the tensions of living together in close quarters and anger when people don't honor rules that even they participated in developing.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody's hiding something, such as talking to their abuser because they don't want to be asked to leave, that's a great moment to say, she has a need here. How can I help her with that? How can I help her with that? Because if we're not helping her with it, then it means that she's not getting support around dealing with this abuser, right? So a couple of things to think about, and this is a frame from Margaret, is that we can go from here. This doesn't cost anything, right? This costs a little bit of money. This costs a lot more money. This costs lots and lots more money. But we can start here. Rethinking our space. You know, who comes to stay is confidential, but the location itself doesn't have to be a secret. We can redecorate our spaces to be less professional looking, and I understand, you know, our desire to be taken seriously by the rest of the world, you know, sometimes gets us down this path of having dress codes and, you know, having this doctor's office feeling that that can be a barrier for people who are worried that they don't fit in where we are with us. So, you know, creating spaces that are cozy, you know, not these giant rooms, but small, cozy, comfortable spaces where and you know, this is some of the trauma learning that we have now, is understanding that people who have experienced trauma need oftentimes a smaller, comfortable space for themselves and their kids. Having visual cues, because we know that people who are highly traumatized oftentimes aren't picking up on all the words that we're talking to them about or the signs. And doing things that make it in a shelter setting that people have more control over what's going on with their family, so that we don't have to have all these rules and spend all of our time breaking up fights around what happened to my kids' Cheerios. Remodeling so that we don't have to have rules like you have to keep your child with you at all times. You know, even if you need to, that's hard when you want to go to the bathroom or have a smoke break. But having visual sight lines in the space, private bedrooms, private baths, so that people who have been sexually violated in the course of the domestic violence, which is, you know, pretty much almost everybody, that they're able to control and not be re-triggered all the time by having shared space and not being able to know who's coming in and out of their own bedroom. You know, having key cards rather than these alarm systems where we need to basically lock people in at night. And then, you know, rethinking where our facilities are. Does it have to be away? Can it be in the community? Can we have scattered sites, or do we need to really even be running a shelter, a physical shelter? Can we move to being sheltering, which is a verb, rather than having a shelter, which is a noun? And I just want to pause here and say, I know that these can be very radical ideas that are very challenging. I want to say that they have been tried out in many parts of the country, including in Washington State, Portland, Oregon,
Washington, D.C.,
Iowa, whatever. And people are doing it, and we'd love to help you connect. If you're interested, if this seems relevant to you, check out the this Building Dignity site, because there's a lot of very practical examples here. This was done with an architecture firm. So there's layout plans, and then you can see what are the examples from different peers with not a lot of resources to more resources. Okay, so I, Judy, am going to wrap up my chat and turn it over to my excellent coworker, Linda.
Great, thanks, Judy. A lot to think about, and I am excited to be talking about domestic violence housing first, and this is what brought me to work at the Coalition. About 5 years ago, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation approached the Coalition to ask if there might be some interest in coordinating a pilot project across the state to see how well domestic violence survivors might do with Housing First strategies. So the Coalition said yes. We started out with 4 pilot sites. They were all around the state, one in eastern Washington in a very, very rural location, and then the others were on the west side, 2 medium-sized communities and an urban community. And that went so well. We found out so many exciting things that I'll get into a little bit more in a minute, that the Gates Foundation said, well, let's just expand it. So they added another year to the 2 years that the first 4-group cohort had, and then they added 9 more agencies. The intent was only to do another 4 agencies, but there was so much interest across the state that they responded in a way that really pulled in some great representation. And our interest from the Coalition's viewpoint aspect was really to make sure that we were working with the highest needs, most vulnerable, marginalized populations that we could. So as you can see there, we included tribal programs. There are 3 tribal programs. 9 of the 13 programs are rural. Another few are culturally specific, one for refugees and immigrants in downtown Seattle, another that really focuses on the Latina farm worker population that Judy was talking about. So this is our cohort, and we found out that in our effort to do Housing First, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the Housing First philosophy, that is the idea that everybody has the right to housing, that it is housing first, not housing ready, and that we should not necessarily expect people to go through different programs and meet certain expectations in order to have permanent housing. So it's no barriers. And of course, that really is incumbent upon adequate resources in a community and upon the culture of an agency really being able to embrace this. So as we look at survivors retaining and accessing safe permanent housing quickly, and many of them did bypass shelter completely, and my biggest surprise, and I think a big surprise for a lot of folks, was how many survivors wanted to stay in or return to their own homes. There was a large request just to say, could we go back there? That's our community. That's where our kids are in school. If you did this, this, and this to help me make this unit safe, I would really be comfortable there. Many survivors also described how just with some economic support for a short period of time, that was a good option. And for many of our rural programs, what we heard from them was because the housing stock in their communities were so short that it was much easier and more economically feasible to return to a home or stay in a home than to try and find new housing. So that was just what we found in terms of stability and the healing process and the beautiful stories that we heard from survivors as they returned to stayed in their homes and supported their children. You know, that freedom to choose how best to rebuild their lives. And I just wanted to mention a question that's there and really say I understand that whole sense of self-determination for those who have had so much taken from them, are so traumatized, are so impacted mentally, don't have the self-esteem. And, you know, we've all sat there and looked at the survivor who just said, I don't know, just tell me what I should do. So I really want to acknowledge that as a dynamic that takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of respect, it takes a lot of conversation to find out what that person really wants to do with her life. And I'm not saying that it's easy, especially when there is that plea of just help me do something. I don't care. I don't know how to make these decisions anymore. So want to acknowledge that it's doable, and again, it takes that cultural shift within an agency in terms of how our survivors mobile advocacy, meeting people where they are, where they want to be met, survivor-driven, and the stories that have come up have not only been in those Latina farm worker fields and the Salal fields in the forests of the Olympic Peninsula, but also in parks and powwow grounds, in little cafes, a variety of places that someone decided was the best place that they could be, watch their kids, could get to, and felt like they could have a conversation. So that sense of flexibility from staff. And you will see on our website that there are a lot of ideas about safety and mobile advocacy, safety for advocates, as well as safety when working with survivors. Housing search support. This was one of those things that we learned that our advocates did kind of that tap dance with survivors. They would help them, they would support them, they wouldn't necessarily orchestrate where somebody should go, and they tried to be very responsive to a survivor's wishes to be in a certain community. And of course, sometimes costs could be prohibitive, so that didn't always work, but the reality of sitting down with someone and a budget and what the resources are and what someone could think about doing, and then helping them focus a search accordingly. Advocates would work with landlords and housing authorities on the relationships. Sometimes those were atrocious, sometimes those were wonderful, sometimes atrocious relationships were turned into really strong, wonderful ones. But just having that sense of community presence and working not just with landlords and housing authorities, but also other sorts of resources in the community. That could be religious organizations, people's cultural communities, trying to figure out where the resources to support somebody could come from and be really creative about that. And then the final thing that we found just so incredibly helpful that was just a particular kudo to the Gates Foundation is that their financial grants to these organizations included a sizable pot of money that was specifically for survivors to use as they chose, and they left it with the advocates and the agencies to determine how that would be distributed. So what all of our agencies ended up doing was just being very responsive and flexible and providing assistance according to what the survivors said would be useful.
And that could range anywhere from $25, $50 for bus tickets, maybe a one-child care session, or a license for some sort of job that needed to be done. It could be car repairs, it could be critical furnishings, it might be rental assistance or security deposits. And the average range was about $2,500 to $3,000 per family, and that was what was enough. And again, the range was $25, and one program used as much as $12,000 for a year to help support a survivor's stability. And I am looking at a question that says, costs, staff, it sounds great, but we don't have money. And yes, not everybody has a Gates Foundation that is saying, well, let's try this. And that's one of the reasons we're doing the evaluation. We're hoping to be able to do some research related to this so that we can use that Gates money and this Gates project as seeds to influence perhaps public funders, to inspire private foundations. And we're also hoping that the tools that could be available could be used in individual communities to also inspire community donors. So again, everybody has to do this to scale. I think of the smaller community programs that have 2 or 3 staff, are tribal programs in particular that are very small. And you know, you have to do it to scale according to what your resources are, and add gradually. Think about doing it differently in a way that works with you. So this is Judy. One of the things I want to just add, perhaps you could speak to, Linda, is that there actually are a number of programs that previously operated a 24/7 shelter that were, you know, they have to pay the cost of the building, or, you know, facing a rebuild after 30 years of their building being slowly destructed by small children, and staff at 24/7, which is very, very expensive. And, you know, what about programs that are that have shifted to a different model and that perhaps it's more cost effective? Yeah, one of our cohort agencies did completely get rid of their shelter and are using a variety of, again, this Housing First model, prevention dollars, as well as hotel vouchers. They have some incredible relationships with motels, hotels in their community that are positive, and this is not the type of vouchering program where you just dump somebody in the hotel and say that that's it, but it is that same sort of engagement that you would provide someone who might potentially be in a shelter. We've also had organizations that moved out of a communal living shelter into a scattered site apartment model, which enabled them, as money came in, they could have more apartments, use more apartments, and increase capacity. If they got funding cuts here and there, they were able to let go of apartments. And again, that takes an amazing landlord relationship. So this is just a quick overview for our evaluation data. In cohort 2, this was the cohort that really represented higher needs, marginalized populations. When we looked at the survivors coming into the program entry, 53% had permanent housing, over half, which was amazing. It was quite a deep increase from what we saw even in cohort 1. And that it increased to 86% of people in permanent housing by January 2013. So that was roughly over a 2-year period. And I think, again, it's important to be sure that the permanent housing options need to reflect a community's resources. We know that rapid rehousing is kind of the going thing right now, and there are a lot of survivors that really work well within that model as long as your local jurisdiction doesn't impose a very rigid sort of time frame around it. And there are survivors that definitely need longer sorts of supportive services, as well as deeper investment, vouchering, whether it's Section 8, whether it is
just being able to be in permanent supportive housing for those who might qualify for that. But certainly that depends upon the kind of community that you're in. I just, maybe going back to that, I know time is running short, but I just also wanted to say that that we actually did a modified version of Jackie Campbell's risk assessment as survivors came in, and we did a follow-up 6 months after they had been receiving these services, and got a very strong approval or sense of survivors feeling safer and feeling that their danger levels had decreased. And then just pointing out that 63% of this group of people were people of color, Native people. Actually, a third of these folks were Native American. So again, very, very high. I like Judy's thing, buy-in for culturally specific providers, because I think that is what we ended up doing, and it's been very gratifying, and the providers themselves have really enjoyed it. So now we're going to move to a video that shows in about 3 minutes the cultural shifts that one of our first cohort agencies went through.
Our organization had a dream, and that dream was that we didn't have to turn people away. In providing advocacy services for survivors of domestic violence and their children, we found ourselves sometimes having to either turn people away or to see them come back to us because their needs had not been met. The reality of having permanent housing where family could become rooted in the communities did not exist.
The issue of domestic violence and homelessness, I mean, it's a critical issue. And so when a woman and her child or a household comes to us and brings this issue to us, it's not as simple as saying, let's get you into a shelter. I mean, you've got a lot of complex issues that need to be addressed in addition to housing. And that's where I think the Home Plus program does a wonderful job, because it's looking at this cutting-edge approach to homelessness solutions, which is housing first. Let's get a roof over their head. Let's get them into housing first, and then concurrently with that, let's wrap around the services that this woman, this family needs to thrive. Not just survive, but thrive.
We have no problem expressing our emotions, because it meant that it was going to be a cultural shift. Not only in this organization, it was going to be a cultural shift in the lives of survivors in our community, and hopefully if we continue to be as successful as we have been with the project, there's going to be a cultural shift in our community.
Even though we believed in it and we knew that's what we should be doing, we still had probably previous models in place where our families need to be doing A, B, C, D to be able to participate in the program and to be successful. So survivor-driven flexibility, thinking outside the box really became key to, like Linda said, what we did in not only Home Plus, but it totally spilled over into all our programs.
So I became homeless when I was 6 months pregnant, because I chose to be safe and happy, and I didn't have anywhere to go. I tried to go into the shelter, but they told me I couldn't stay if I had my cat. I didn't really know that I could be self-sufficient. I didn't really know that I could do things on my own. I'd forgotten that. I'd lost myself in the idea that I needed someone to take care of me. So living on my own was very scary.
They maybe have been isolated from family and friends over the years when they've been in their relationships. So we're kind of able to step in and be that friend, family support system temporarily until they do become rooted in their community again and are able to move forward on their own.
housing is a huge piece of getting families stable, getting people back into the community, be invested in the community, because if you feel like you have a place to be, then you can give back.
Okay, so we're back on, and I think it's important to say that that I agree with Karen, and there will always be a need for emergency shelter. And I think it's just being creative about what that shelter looks like and moving from the idea of shelter as noun to shelter as verb, that we can think outside of a communal living box, and we can think of other ways to support survivors. But yes, I totally agree there will always be a need for shelter. So I'm also knowing that we are short on time, and it looks like we're going to be giving the final piece, working with chemically dependent survivors, a little bit of short shrift. And I think it is probably a presentation in itself, and just to think of trying to also address sexual assault survivors. We know, especially those of us who have worked in shelter, that as we look at survivors who come to us, many of whom who have turned to drugs and alcohol, that very often there is a history, childhood history of sexual assault, sexual molestation with those survivors. When I opened the transitional housing program for domestic violence, chemically dependent survivors, it was specifically for that population, and it was with the idea that everybody in those days was asking for 3 months, 3 to 6 months clean and sober before someone could come into their program or into their housing program. So I tried to create that, and you know, I'm not sure that I would do exactly the same thing now. We're looking so much more at how can we work with harm reduction. How can we look at a very low to no barriers sort of acceptance for survivors who can't just walk into a program and quit using just because we think they should or say they should or have no tolerance. Patty Bland is someone who has worked with our coalition on a number of different initiatives over the years, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work. But she said that the intervention is just in the asking, just talking about it, and all of the things that we're learning now about trauma and brain development, and the realization that it is just, it's natural. It is a part for any of us who have been hurt, traumatized in that way, to figure out different ways to numb and to cope, whether it's the long-term history of sexual assault, and then adding DV or not, but it is what we're walking around with, and it's so critical that we understand that, and again, meet people where we are and not put down unrealistic expectations about individual sobriety. They're looking to us to help them with the child welfare system, because that's one of the areas where sobriety is so heavily emphasized, and I think some of my biggest heartbreaks and most tears have been shed for survivors who were struggling so to remain sober in order to get their kids back. So it's an area where they need us, and the creativity that we can have both in our housing programs. Again, communal living is not really useful here, despite some of the models that have been going on, including my own. Because of the impacts of survivors who relapse, survivors who are still using, on survivors struggling with recovery. So I just wanted to mention, in terms of the treatment options and alternatives to 12 steps, there is a great resource, Stephanie Covington, on 12 steps, and she's done a book specifically, 12 Steps for Women. And she's also done a fantastic group piece, group series for trauma survivors that I would really recommend that you take a look at and try to integrate into your programs. So finally, the last slide here is, again, bringing up all of the resources that we've worked with Patty Bland with when she was at the Alaska Coalition and now at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Please take a minute to look at this website and think about how you can frame services and adapt what you're doing so that survivors who are struggling with trauma and struggling with all of the rather unhealthy means to cope with that, see how you can support them in a way where they can find a path to health. I know you can. You're all creative. So this is Judy, and our piece is wrapped up, and we turn it over now to Donna and Christopher.
Thank you, Judy and Linda. I'd actually like to turn the floor over to Donna for just a few moments to offer a few reflections.
Sure. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay is the first thing. And I would like to take a moment to thank Judy and Linda for bringing forth their presentations today. I learned so much myself as an active learner in this process. And in listening into the content today, I couldn't help but think about the implications of what was presented here today as it relates to the management of our organizations as well as the future of our organizations. And as Christopher noted at the beginning of the webinar, the particular project that we're working on right now for OVW is what we refer to as the Grow Forward project. And as a part of this work, we're looking in particular at the questions about our future as it relates to our organizations, as in terms of course, how we're funding them for the future, but then also the characteristics and our policies and our practice that best support us to move forward in a way that maintains our creativity, our commitment to survivor-defined work, and our future as a strong and vital movement for social change. And so there are many things that are on my mind right now, but in particular I want to harken back to something that Judy commented on at the very beginning, the importance of us shaping our future, because if we don't do it for ourselves, it will be done to us. I think she and Linda talked about some of the best practices that support us to be active in shaping our futures, including the importance of the critical thinking, a commitment to critical thinking. And so I jotted down a note here for myself. It's like, okay, how do we know critical thinking is happening in our organizations? What tradition and or practices do we have around critical thinking? And how do we use data as a part of that practice? Also, another point that was highlighted, the importance of adapting. As we evolve, part of evolution requires adaptation. So what are our strategies? How do we practice this? These are all the things that I encourage all of us to think more about coming off this webinar. And there were several points here, including this conversation at the end about housing first. It also came up for me around the Latino mobile response point that Judy illustrated for us. So that I think that some things perhaps are counterculture for us to think about, given our history in doing this work, but they're not counterintuitive. And so in thinking about shelters, you know, we have spent so much time thinking about how to get women into shelters safely. And so it's counterculture for us to be thinking deeper, basically, on some levels, about how to keep women out of shelters. And that critical question can lead us to different places as far as the strategies we employ. So I would just like to say that in closing, there was this beautiful comment made. I'm not sure if it was Linda or Judy, and one of them stated that we have the power to change. And I think this is really what I view as something that's very inspiring, is to think that what we've created is also something that we can help evolve and change over time. And finally, in closing, I just want to say that if you have best practices, there were so many great comments made in the chat box. If you have best practices that you would like to share with us so that we can help make those available to the broader community of learners that we all are together, please contact Christopher with your information. We would very much like the opportunity to make that information available to the broader audience of OVW-funded projects. So thank you all.
Cool. Thanks, Donna. Unfortunately, we're actually out of time, so we just want to thank you all for joining us on our webinar today. We also especially want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their support in funding this particular project, and additionally, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Justices, or judges, excuse me, for partnering with us to host this webinar today. Quickly, before we go, we ask that you take just a few moments to fill out the evaluation survey. I've posted the link a couple of times in the chat box, and the link will also appear at the conclusion of this webinar. Your feedback is super important, and we use it to shape future trainings and webinars and whatnot. So thank you in advance for completing that. We also want to quickly remind folks that we have 3 additional webinars scheduled between now and August the 1st. So the topics include facing 21st century challenges in our work. We also are going to have a webinar talking about engaging survivors as social change agents. And then finally, doing different with less and what we perceived to be the new normal of social change work. So the first one coming up is going to be redefining our work in the 21st century, challenges, competitive funding, increased use of technology, and cross-section collaboration and more. And that's going to take place on Friday, May the 30th. And this is going to be open to all current OVW grantees. So to find out more information, just be on the lookout for this particular announcement from the place that you heard about this webinar, or you can visit our website, which is www.transformcommunities.org. So finally, I want to say thank you to the presenters, Judy and Linda, for their great information and their great work. Unfortunately, we don't have time for them to stick around and handle questions, but there are a few questions that were outstanding in the chat box, and I'll make every effort to try and answer those questions directly via email offline. So thank you very much for your time and your interaction and your engagement, and don't forget to fill out the evaluation at the end, which will pop up immediately after the webinar. Thank you all very much.